Shalom to everybody. Welcome back to our series on learning Hebrew, where last week we were introduced to the Nikudot, which were the Hebrew vowel markings, and today we're going to be continuing with a few more markings, followed by some grammatical rules. So I titled this one Hebrew Linguistics, Reading Essentials, because hopefully this lesson will be our final lesson before we can enter into our practicing of Hebrew transliteration and reading. So here on the screen is the table of contents of what we're going to be reviewing today. And while this might be our longest lesson, I do want to note again, this is our attempt at a final run at grammar and rules and some frequently asked questions at the end before we're able to enter into our practice. These are the subjects I found to be most important so that later on when we're actually reading and doing our practice, we don't have to say, oh, I forgot to mention this or I forgot to review this. So I think these are the sort of the essential topics we must review. So the first and most important marker we need to go over is the shvana and the shvanach. Okay, and just a little note, the aleph doesn't take a shvana, so it's really just there as our marker, but you can think of any other letter with a shvana. Okay, as you can see, the shvana marker is just two vertical dots. And while it goes by two names, it's the same dottings. Its pronunciation relies on its surrounding letters and vowels, so you're going to need to be aware of its rules. So the shva can be seen as quite complicated, but of course, as with the rest of what we've learned, as long as you continue to practice and repeat what you're learning, you'll get it down in no time. So first and foremost, let's define the difference between the shvana and the shvanach. Why does it have two different names? So the Shvana is the name when it's vocal, meaning there is a brief S sound. And it's called Shvanach when it's silent. So it's a pause in a word. Again, it is called by the name Shvana when it is audible, making a very, very brief S sound. So brief that it's almost like it's not there. And then it's referred to as Shvanach when it is silent, meaning its syllable is totally done and it continues on to the next. So let's go over 6 rules you'll want to get down in regard to the Shva. So this first rule is definitely easy to remember. The Shva at the beginning of a word will always be audible, a brief eh sound. Um, Whenever you see a Shva at the beginning of a word, always the first letter of a word, it is automatically an audible eh. But remember, it is barely audible or briefly audible. What does that mean? It means that you shouldn't exaggerate its pronunciation as if it were its own syllable. Okay, and here's an example. Look at the first word on the right. So if we were to transliterate this one, it'd be a shin and then a shva, right? So if we were to put a little e to transliterate an audible shva, we would continue with the mem, the patach, and we don't need to put an apostrophe for the ayin because it's the last letter. So you might wonder, isn't it translated as shema, as right there, Shema? That is the popular transliteration because each time the shvana or the audible shva is transliterated, some people use the English letter E, right? However, some people choose not to translate the shva at all. So what would they put? Well, we'd erase the E and they would just put an apostrophe. Shema, Shema. Okay. So as you can see, it may not seem like there's a difference with an E or without any, but of course, think about it this way. People who don't know about Hebrew or its rules, they might even be inclined if they saw the E there, let's put the E back. If they saw the E in this word, maybe somebody might think it's pronounced Shema, Shema, which is incorrect. And Professor Zev Garber at Los Angeles Valley College, he actually tells a story of how when he interviewed a leader of the Samaritans in Israel, he asked about the pronunciation of the hero Israel, right? The Shema Israel. And to his surprise, the Samaritan's pronunciation sounded like Shema Yisrael, Shema Yisrael, which took Professor Garber aback, right? Because when it's pronounced like that, to Garber's ears, it sounds like one is saying, perhaps, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So, the importance is seen here. Of course, it's not to negate or demean the Samaritan tradition in any way, but it's only highlighting its difference. So make sure you don't overemphasize the shva as it's never supposed to be pronounced as its own syllable. Okay, so this might appear as shema, shema, okay, but if you wanted to, this would also be acceptable. Shema, shema, shema. Right? And the next example right here, let me just read it for you. Beracha, bracha. I'm going to transliterate it. I'm going to skip the shva for right now. Okay, you see that? Bracha, I'll do the final H2. Again, it also uses many people use an E in their transliterations, but again, this may lead people to think that it's beracha, beracha, okay? But really it's supposed to be like this. Like think of the word bring, bring. Between the B and the R, there's a tiny, almost unnoticeable or sort of sound that's just automatically pronounced between the two letters. So in that same way, that's how the shva needs to be treated. Okay, so it's not beracha, beracha. Just imagine it as bracha, bracha. But again, a lot of commentaries or transliterations that I've seen, sort of in Jewish writings that I have, they go for the e. I guess that's just the default for some people. Okay, so my recommendation, or what I've become accustomed to, is I simply put an apostrophe to transliterate the shva. Because even though we're considering it audible here, if you would rather choose a letter to transliterate it, then yes, you could use the letter E. So both ways are correct and used, but the apostrophe sort of reminds you that it's not supposed to be overemphasized in its pronunciation. As you can see here with Shema, instead of Shema, it's not Shema, it's Shema. And Bracha, Bracha, not Beracha. The shva at the end of a word will always be silent. The word ends there. So while the first rule is specifically shvana, which we now know as the audible shva, here we see the second rule being specifically in reference to the shvanach, meaning anytime it's at the end of a word, it is automatically shvanach, or the silent shva. For these examples, both words have a chaf sofit at the end, as you see, which is typically paired with the shva at the end of a word. So simply put, the chaf sofit in these examples is the final sound in the word. Well, you might wonder, why doesn't every word ending in a consonant have to end with a shva then? No, the answer is that the shva at the end of a word is typically only associated with letters that are also known to have other vowels attached to it, especially in the case of chaf sofit. So chaf sofit should not just necessarily be implied to end in a shva, as like the syllable ends there, because there are words where a vowel is attached to it, and for example, Elohecha, and you have the kamatz right under the chaf sofit. So just to transliterate both of these, this is the word Baruch. I hope you see that what I'm doing is I'm doing letter, vowel, letter, vowel, letter, vowel, etc. And then this word right here is mem, sigol, lamed, sigol, chaf sofit. So we have Baruch and Melech, okay? Meaning that the chaf sofit does not continue, the word ends with a chaf sofit. The third rule is when there are two shvas in the middle of a word, the first is silent and the second is audible. So in this example, the first would be under the letter shin, the second under the letter pei. So consider the following example. Do not pronounce them as if they are both audible as mishepetei, right? No, that's too emphasized. Instead, it'd be easier to just treat them as if they were both silent. Okay, just try that. Since the audible sound that we need after the pei, it's going to come naturally, because when it's paired with these as these consonants, pei and tet, the pronunciation of p and t in between them are automatically going to have that exact sound that we need. So mish ptei, ptei, ptei. You hear that right in between the pei and the tet. It's already there. So you don't need to do mish pete as its own syllable. Mish pete. Mish pete. Okay. So notice how, again, in between the pei and the tet, it's not like I'm forcing an audible sound, but rather it just comes about naturally when pronouncing these consonants concurrently. When there are two shva at the end of a word, both are silent. So the last rule was in regards to shva in the middle of a word. Now we're looking at shva at the end of a word, both of them being silent. So here's a mock word, a simple transliteration of the English word. Remember, it's not ant, because Hebrew doesn't have that s sound. It's unt, unt. Right. Again, simply put, if it ends with two shvana, just pronounce the consonants. So rule number 5 is when the shva is followed by a long vowel, it is audible. When it is followed by a short vowel, it is silent. Okay, so here's a rule that might seem awfully important. First off, what are long and short vowels? Well, that is where our handy charts come in. Remember last week. So for people who dozed off or considered it maybe as not so important to distinguish between the lengths of the vowel letters that we saw last week, the nikodot, this is where they come into play. Okay, so to transliterate these examples, this first word on the right here would be mem, kirik, tzadi. Okay, then once I get to the shva, I ask myself, is that shvana or shvanach? Do I transliterate it or do I just treat it as silent? Well, remember the rule. The shva, when it's preceded by a short vowel, is silent. The chirik here is a short vowel because it has no yod. It's chirik chaser. So I'm just going to ignore the shva. Let's just pretend it's not there. And then I'm going to put the vav, kamatz, and hey. Mitzvah. So it's not mitzvah, mitzvah. It's just mitzvah. Now, there are those like me. Let's say I transliterate every shva with just an apostrophe. That works too. Mitzvah, mitzvah. Okay. Now, the second word, we start off with the lamed, and then first off, we have a shva in the first letter. And what did we learn? Is that audible or silent? Go back to rule number 1. When a shva is at the beginning of a word, it is audible. So, okay, let's just put a little e there and an apostrophe. And then we put a vet, a kamatz, another vet, and then we're at another shva. What do we put here? Well, look at the vowel that precedes it. It is a long vowel. A kamatz is a long vowel. So that means it's audible. So both shva in this word they're both audible, so I can just put a little e and an apostrophe and finish off the word. Levavecha, levavecha, levavecha. And for our final rule, rule number 6, when the shva is under a letter with a dagesh, a dot, it is audible. So another thing to note is that when you're transliterating letters with a dagesh in them, sometimes, most of the time, people treat them as a double letter. They put double of the letter, but that's more of an English practice. Definitely not in Spanish. In Spanish, I've never seen a doubling of the letter, really. But you don't have to do it. It's not like set in stone. For example, here we have the word, let's transliterate it. First we have the sheen, and the sheen here is doubled, but we're not going to put SH. We'll just treat it as an emphasis. Then we have the chirik, then we have the mem. Now here's the important thing, ignoring the doubling. Is the shva audible or silent? Well, it is preceded by a short vowel, but that's not the rule here. Right now, it's superseded by the fact that the mem has a dagesh in it, meaning that it is audible. So we're going to put a little e, an apostrophe, and I'm going to finish off the word. So Professor Garber taught me about this word, shimecha, 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 shimecha. He said that today, no one is going to make that distinction. He said today he can show you on his fingers on one hand how many people would actually notice that it's shimecha. No, he says people in Israel today, they're just going to say shimcha, shimcha. Okay, and with that, I wanted to end this portion by saying that my sound advice for beginners is don't stress too much about whether it's audible or silent. Okay, if you read or speak out loud, you're going to be fine by just always treating it as if it was silent. Professor Garber said technically, if we're speaking grammatically correct, it would be shimcha. But today, everybody just says shimcha. Okay, so you're going to be pretty much fine just treating every single shva as silent, because if it's not a silent shva, then most of the time, the fact that there's going to be two consecutive consonants that might just automatically force a tiny audible shva out of you either way. So my advice, just don't stress and just treat it as a silent shva, right? This has been the rules for the shvana and the shvanach. So our next topic are diphthongs, which occur when two vowels are combined to form a new sound. So this might seem like a new thing, but it's within the same ballpark, and I'll try to put it very simply. Right? First and foremost, there are two different ways to transliterate the letter yod, right? Well, when we learned it as a consonant, yod as a consonant is y, right? But when it's treated as a vowel, we can use the letter I. Basically, when the yod has a vowel sound under it, that is your indication that, okay, yod is being treated as a consonant. But when the yod doesn't have a vowel sound under it, as seen in all these examples, that should alert you that it relies on the vowel presence nearby. So for these examples, I'm going to be using the letter I to transliterate yod in connection to Hebrew diphthongs. So we're going to look at four words today, each representing a vowel sound and how the yod turns the vowel into a diphthong. Let's begin with the A sound, okay? So as you see here, look at how I would transliterate the first word, right? It starts off with aleph, so I don't need to put an apostrophe. It's the beginning of a word. I could just start off with the chataf patach, dalet, that's a cholam, it's a nun, kamatz, okay, and then that final yod, I can just treat it as an I. Here's a prime example of, there are very few people that I've seen that transliterate that final yod. If it were actually a consonant, I would have to put Y. But the most popular transliterations, as I'm sure you've seen, renders it as I. Because an important note, imagine this is the way I see it. The difference between choosing Y and I think some people choose the I over the Y because if this word ended with a Y, some readers who don't know Hebrew the way you do, they might be led to think it's Adonai. Adonai. They might sort of conflict it with or conflate it with their English understanding, Adonai. But transliterations are all about trying to stay true to the original sound in the original language. So whatever symbols or letters you do prefer, what really matters is that we're pronouncing it the same. But it stays clear that the kamatz yod here is supposed to be a diphthong that makes up the word I. I. So the kamatz has an a sound, and when it's followed by a yod, it turns from a to I. I. Notice how it's not two separate vowels, right? But they're combined. Nobody says Adonai, Adonai, Adonai. No, it's combined Adonai, Adonai. Okay, and next let's look at the S sound as the second example. I would transliterate it like this, with its Chataf Segol, Lamed, Cholam, Hey, Tsere, and then the final yod. Since it's a diphthong, since it's acting as a vowel, I'll put I. Okay, again, notice here the diphthong is the tsere yod. So instead of it combines the vowel sounds a. Okay. Again, nobody says Elohei, 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 but rather the diphthong means it's combined to sound as Elohei, Elohei. Okay. And then we have this letter, this third word, which I hope you get the gist of it now. We're going to start off with a gimel, a cholam maleh, and hey, look at that. A final yod, we'll just put an I. This is goy, meaning, oh, well, actually, let me go back to saying Adonai means my Lord. Elohei means my God. So goy is Gentile or in reference to someone of the nations. But one note I will make about the word goy is that this is actually the one word that I've seen that is popularly transliterated with a Y instead of an I, which goes to show you that, again, transliteration is not the important factor, but rather whatever helps us get to the same pronunciation. So whether you use a Y or an I, as long as we're both saying the same thing, we're sounding out the same thing, then it's fine. You could use whatever you want. But finally, this final word, we have the U sound, which we use the letter U in English, is Vav, Hirik, Dalet. And here's an example of how in English I can double the letter, but in Spanish people just treat it as one letter. And then this is the Shiruk, and finally a Yod. Again, notice how it's not vidui, vidui, with a break, but rather both both vowels are combined, and they're pronounced together, vidui, vidui. Here too, I've seen some people use the letter Y. So that was our review of the diphthongs, and I hope that stays clarified. The more you see diphthongs, the more you'll get used to them. But just also remember, they can be at the beginning of a word. No, sorry, they can be in the middle of a word or the end of the word, not necessarily just at the end. All right, so the next topic we're going to review is a good question I received on Facebook this past week. I wanted to clarify this topic about what you're seeing on screen is referred to as the Beged Kefit letters, which are 6 letters that historically had 2 pronunciations, depending on whether or not they had a dagesh in them. So 3 of these still exist in modern Hebrew, which we've seen when we practice the alphabet, right? We've seen, look at the letters that I've put in just black. We know the bet and the vet, we know the kaf and the chaf, and now we know the pei and the fei. Okay, these variations are familiar to us, but modern Hebrew has actually lost the distinction in the letters I've presented in red. So the gimel, the dalet, and the tav, again, modern Hebrew doesn't differentiate between the hard and soft versions of gimel, dalet, and tav. So that's why we only stick to one pronunciation of each letters. However, there are indeed some communities, which are in the minority, that have attempted to retain these differences. For example, there are some people that pronounce the soft tav, as you see here. They would say the tav with a dagesh is a t, and the tav without a dagesh is a th. Okay, but again, that is more just a minority. I have, in all the transliterations that I've studied, I can't say I ever recall this being a go-to. Same would go for the dalet or the gimel. It's just at this point it's lost and it's just treated as their regular sounds. All right, and the next grammatical rule we're going to be talking about is the patach genuva, or the stolen patach. Okay, notice that right here, a patach under the letters chet, ayin, or hey, and this hey is important. It's a hey with a mapik. At the end of a word is sounded before the letter and not after. Okay, we're going to look at some examples. But again, notice that hey has a dot in it when some might assume, oh, it's a dagesh in the hey, but actually it's not a dagesh. It's referred to as its own marker. It's a hey with a more breathalyzed sound. So you definitely pronounce that exhale. This is referred to as the mapik hey. Okay, now let's look into some examples of what this might look like. So here are 3 words. And again, remember the rule. When a patach is under these letters, always at the end of a word, the patach is pronounced before the consonant, before the final letter. Okay, so if I read it directly, it'd be nun, cholam, and then I'd say, well, look at that, there's a patach under the chet. How do I pronounce it? Again, read it directly, the first example may appear to look like that says nocha, but you know better, you know the rule. It's not nocha, it's noach. And just for clarification, don't treat this as a diphthong. This is noach, noach, 2 different vowels. And this is the biblical name of the biblical character Noah. Okay. Again, you see what we did here, where the patach, under any other letter, under any other circumstance, it would be pronounced after the letter. But this is the rule. This is the instance where the patach is pronounced before the final letter. Okay. And the second example, if you read that incorrectly, that looks like rucha, but it's not rucha. You know the rule. Resh, shuruk, and now we know that it's reversed. The patach, then the consonants. That says ruach, ruach, which is translated as spirit or wind. And the last example I wanted to show you here is that it's the patach genuva, the stolen patach, is most notable when the patach is under the chet or the mapike. But when it's under the ayin, it's pretty easy. Like you might not even remember that this is part of the rule. Why? Because ayin is a silent letter. So even if you pronounce it one way or another, there's really only one. If we pronounce ayin as a glottal stop, wrongly read, some people might think it's yeshua, 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 thinking that the ayin is a pause, but it's reversed. So instead of yeshua, it's Yeshua. And if I were to respect that ayin, then I would say Yeshua, Yeshua, with that glottal stop at the end of the word. But that's something that nobody ever really pronounces. The ayin is not treated as a glottal stop. It's just Yeshua, Yeshua, instead of Yeshua, Yeshua. That ayin is supposed to be a pause. But anyways, you see here the rules are reversed. Again, the patach at the end of a word, when it is only under these three letters, the chet, the ayin, and the mapike, it is reversed. That is the stolen patach. So the final sign we'll talk about before we get into the final subjects is the meteg. Okay, so you'll notice this if you own some of ArtScroll Publications books, for example, a transliterated version of the Book of Psalms. You'll notice this sign a lot because, as we've mentioned, most of the time the emphasis or the stress of a word is at the end of the word. And this is seen in pretty much most standard Spanish or Sephardic pronunciations. However, in the instances where the stress is not on the last syllable, the meteg is there to help you know where in the word the stress or the emphasis is supposed to be. So on the screen you can see a few examples of the meteg marker. So look at that first word. The meteg under the vet right here tells you that the stress is on that syllable. So contrary to, let's say, some people might say it's aviv, aviv. No. Aviv, aviv. This refers to the month or springtime. That meteg tells us the emphasis is on this vowel, aviv. Okay. Look at that second example. What it's not, it's not avinu, avinu, no, or it's not avinu, avinu. No, it's avinu, avinu. You see that meteg, that vertical line helps us know where the emphasis is. And finally, the third example is popular. Avinu means our father, by the way. The third example means bread, and the meteg tells us it's lechem, lechem. It's not lechem, lechem. Rather, it's lechem. Okay. So while some pronounce it the other way around, with the stress at the end, the meteg tells us the stress in the first syllable is the preferable correct one. So for these last two subjects, they're really questions I wanted to address regarding what you will probably see in your Hebrew Bibles and future discussions. So the first question would be, what are cantillation marks? Because when you open your Hebrew Bibles, or texts such as the Chumash or the Torah or the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, you'll be able to recognize the vowel markings by now. So let me show you right there. Right there. So what's cool is, yeah, you know the vowel markings, but there are so many other markings that we've never mentioned. Okay, and you might be wondering, are we going to mention them? Well, this is technically all we need to say right now. Those markings that you don't recognize, they're not vowel sounds, but they're referred to as cantillation marks. Okay, as you see here, I know what the hirik is, I know what the tser is, I know what the patach is, but I don't know what these little swervy lines are, or this like right angle. Again, they're not vowel markings, they're cantillation marks. So if this is the first time you're hearing about cantillation markings, well, then you might wonder how come it's not more popular to mention it, how come people don't mention it more? Again, the answer is that it's not very popular at all. Cantillation markings are musical notations within the texts. Okay, so on a Shabbat service, when people are called up to the Torah readings, you'll notice they don't just read in Hebrew, they sing the portions. The sing-song recitation of the Torah and even the Talmud allows for better memorization in pronunciations. So I once asked my professor, Zev Garber, if this was popular, and he said that nowadays only cantors or the Jewish leaders of a community that are reciting these texts, they're the only ones that are familiar with the cantillation markings. And aside from that, it's not very popular as it is an entirely separate system from the Nikudot. So the next time you open up your Chumash or Tanakh to see those curved lines, just remember they're not for you. Okay, they're for people who sing their recitations. And on the screen here, I have Psalm 133 as an example, where people like me, who are not trained in cantillation marks or the cantorial reading, we can only read it simply, right, with my brain automatically ignoring the markings I don't need. So likewise, you should do the same. Since we're just practicing, we're just reading, maybe a little bit confusing at first, but you'll get used to filtering out which markings are for your pronunciation purposes and which you don't need at all. So I wanted to end with this question, as perhaps you'll hear mentions of it throughout social media, and I guess this is our take on um, sort of what's the subject of some debates online. Well, what is Paleo Hebrew? Okay. Well, to answer that, we must first clarify that everything that we've learned so far about Hebrew, it's actually been based on the Aramaic script, which is also synonymous with the Assyrian script, referred to as Ketav Ashurit. So again, as you see right here on the leftist side, this is the Hebrew alphabet that we know. But really, this is taken from the Aramaic way of writing these letters. Okay. So the ancient Hebrew script, which is known as Paleo Hebrew, that was identical to the Phoenician alphabet, another writing style, and it looks very different than what we know of today. Again, today we're writing it like this on the left side, but in ancient times, Paleo Hebrew looked like this on the right side. Okay, so the topic is the point of major discussion amongst not just people today, of course, but the rabbis in reference to certain implications, because does the shift from Paleo Hebrew to Aramaic script imply that Jews abandoned the script in which God had written the Ten Commandments? And as a little picture here, here's Charlton Heston with in the 1956 film The Ten Commandments, holding the Ten Commandments not in the Hebrew that we have learned, but rather in Paleo Hebrew. Okay? So, furthermore, there's so many Talmudic lessons on the Hebrew alphabet that are all based on the Aramaic script, not on Paleo Hebrew. So how does that make sense when those lessons treat the Aramaic script as having been around forever, when it seems to have been adopted only from the time of Ezra when the Jews were coming back from the Babylonian exile? Well, there are several rabbinic answers, all of which are rooted deeply in tradition, but the only answer I think will suffice for our conversation is from the Rambam, who agrees with the opinion that Jews have been using Ketav Ashurit, the Assyrian script right here on the left, which we've learned. They've been using it forever, and that the name doesn't refer to Assyria, but rather it sounds like the Hebrew word Ashrei, meaning praises or fortunate. So thus, one doesn't need to fret about the seemingly foreign origins of the alphabet that's used. However, from a historical point of view, one that values tradition for what it is, I think there are indeed those of us who can acknowledge that there are transitionings, there are evolutions of alphabets. So the adoption of writing styles from one culture to the other, it's not something that worries us in the first place. So I wanted to end with this little mention that just yesterday, actually, I went to the Ronald Reagan Museum in Simi Valley, California, with Brother John from my community who invited me, and it was so fascinating. He took me to the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit, which is available, I think, until September of this year. But yeah, and these are pictures that I took when I was there of the Dead Sea Scrolls, where this picture right here on the right, both of them on the right, these are documents containing several psalms. And interestingly, each mention of the name of God, I don't know if anyone can zoom in wherever you're watching this, uh, they're written in Paleo Hebrew, while the rest of it is Ketav Ashurit. The rest of it, you might even be able to recognize some letters. But when it comes to the name of God, the Yud, He, Vav, He, those 4 letters are written in Paleo Hebrew. So, again, these are documents containing several Psalms. And then on the top left here is a fragment of Deuteronomy 33 to 34. That's the Song of Moses, which is the end of the Torah, written in Katav Ivri. Sorry, Katav Ashurit, what we would know. And in the middle left right here, this is actually a replica of the 10 Commandments scroll, which was so cool to see, to be able to recognize where the commandments are in that scroll. And on the bottom left right here, we have a fragment of a document that is based on Ezekiel 40 to 48 regarding an apocalyptic vision of Jerusalem's architectural plan. So again, most of these Dead Sea Scrolls that we saw, they used the Aramaic script, the Hebrew that we know, reserving the Hebrew script, the Paleo Hebrew script, for the holiest parts. So in this point of view, there is that speculation that the writers at Qumran only used the Hebrew script for the parts that God spoke himself or in reference to God's name. So all of this is just to show you that this discussion does exist and you shouldn't be foreign to it, at least not anymore. Now you know. So from here on out, in line with the rest of Rabbinical Judaism, we're learning Katav Ashurit, the block style, as it's the dominant style. So we've reached the end of our lesson, and hopefully these different rules will allow you to be more conscious as you work on your Hebrew and both your pronunciation and your transliterations. And so next, from this point forward, we're going to be practicing on our pronunciations and transliterations together. And later we're going to be going into a more rabbinic side of the Hebrew alphabet as we're going to restart a special series I shared titled Learning Lashon HaKodesh. So I hope you're all following along nicely. Of course, I appreciate every single comment, everybody that's reached out to me with any questions, and I hope to continue addressing anything that you have in mind. Any questions, comments, concerns, just let me know. Thanks for watching. Shalom, shalom to all.